Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now it feels like forever since we've put together a cheap budget gaming PC here on this channel from start to finish, so in today's video I'm going to be doing just that. Without further ado, let's get into it. I'll talk to you about each individual component, why I chose it, and at the end of it all we'll be benchmarking it with a few modern titles to see how well it holds up. So let's get into it and begin the video. So I've decided to base this build around a first generation Core i5 processor. It's probably not the best value for money system I've ever put together, but it is cheap and I wanted to build something for a change instead of upgrading a pre-built. This socket 1156 i5 750 features 4 cores, 4 threads and is very cheap these days. Unlike modern i5 desktop CPUs, the first generation ones weren't all quad cores, and this is important to remember if you're looking for an older i-series CPU yourself. To accommodate the processor, I managed to find a cheap ex-office machine motherboard pulled from an old Dell T1500 workstation. OEM boards can cost less, but it's important to remember that they won't always fit in aftermarket cases. I made sure this one did before buying, though I had to remove the Dell heatsink brace from the underside of the board so that I could fit a standard 1156 fan on here. This was easy enough to do as it was only held on with adhesive tape. Speaking of heatsinks, I decided to opt for an aftermarket Arctic 11 assembly. I could have purchased a stock one, but this one should keep our CPU even cooler, and it actually cost me less than a generic Intel one would have, so it was the obvious choice here. This combo has been finished off with 8GB of generic DDR3 memory. Before putting this thing together, let's look at the storage choices I've gone for as well, and the power supply and case. Instead of just buying a hard drive, I also found a very reasonably priced 32GB SSD that I'll be using solely for the operating system, in this case Windows 10 Pro. Now because I plan on selling this on afterwards, hopefully for a small profit, I opted for a nearly new case, the Cooler Master Masterbox Lite. One thing I've learnt from selling the occasional PC on eBay is that a nice case will make a difference to your final sale price. Most modern cases have USB 3 front ports, but this one has one of each. And if you want to use an older motherboard like I did, that doesn't have the necessary accommodating slot, don't worry because you can pick up a very cheap adapter. The power supply is another Corsair CX550 which I'm sure you've seen enough of by now. I've said it before and I'll say it again, a decent PSU is worth spending a little more money on, and because I know these are good, if I have the chance to buy one I always will. They're modular too, so that should help keep the cables a little neater, as you only have to plug in what you need. Now for my favourite part, the graphics card. The HD 7870 is one of my all-time favourites, so when I found a good deal on this one I just couldn't resist. I love the reference style cooler with the blower fan too, even if it is a little louder than aftermarket options. Not to mention the colours match the case, and the SSD, which is pretty cool. I'm happy to see this one in such great condition too. It'll work just fine on our 550W PSU requiring two 6-pin connectors. With our components gathered, it's time to put this machine together. So let's get that done now before seeing how well it can play games. To try and make this video enjoyable for all you long-time viewers out there as well as those of you new to PC building, I'll be assembling this machine in a step-by-step fashion. Feel free to skip ahead if you just want to see the benchmarks. The first thing I like to do is install the power supply. This is bottom mounted and of course modular, so the unit and cables won't get in the way as we assemble the rest of the build. This is held in place with 4 screws. If you've never built a PC before, don't worry because it's all nearly that simple. We'll put that to the side for a moment and put together the motherboard combo. The first thing to do is install the processor. Just make sure you line the gold arrow in the corner up with the white marking around the socket on the motherboard before lifting the retention arm, sitting the processor gently in there and pushing the arm back down. Next up is the memory. Each stick doesn't have to be the same brand, but I would advise getting matching sticks if you can, just to ensure that any possibility of error is at its minimum. You can find some pretty good deals on used DDR3 kits these days, and to install just open the clips at the end of each slot and push them in till they click. Now, for the heatsink, if you have a second-hand one, you'll have to apply a pea-sized lump of thermal compound to the processor first, like so, but because I bought a new one, it comes with a layer of decent compound already, and it fixes to the board just like a normal Intel heatsink using the push the pins until they click system. There's a lot of pushing and clicking in PC building. Don't forget to plug the CPU fan into the motherboard too. Before installing the motherboard in the system, be sure to fit the back plate in place. Again, push it in until it clicks. Because I opted for a nearly new case, I also got some goodies included, like these cable ties and motherboard standoffs. Make sure you screw these into the holes inside of the case first, ensuring that they match up with the holes in the motherboard. The board sits on these to prevent it from touching the bare metal and shorting out. With those in place, we can install the motherboard by sitting it on the standoffs and screwing it into place. As we connect all the wires up, I'm not going to talk too much about cable management, as it may not be a big concern of yours if it's your first build, but I will be neatening things up off camera. This is more about showing you where everything goes and hopefully inspiring any of you aspiring system builders out there to give it a go for yourselves. First of all, the 4-pin connector from the power supply connects to the square 4-pin connector, usually located in the top left-hand corner of your motherboard. The 24-pin power connector can also be attached here, using the good old push till it clicks method. Once that's in, we're pretty much halfway done. The other cables attached to the case are pretty much self-explanatory, and line up with their labelled counterparts on the board. If they're not labelled, the pin layout will always be a dead giveaway. The HD audio cable goes to the audio port on the board, and the USB cable goes to, you guessed it, the USB connector. The hardest and most fiddly bit of a PC build is probably the front panel cables. These little individual cables will always likely connect in a different order depending on your motherboard, but all you have to do is to Google your board's model name, followed by the words front panel connector layout to find what you're after. It should then be easy enough to find out what goes where. Now it's time to install the storage. Each case is different of course, but in this case, get it? I had to remove this little enclosure here so that I could slot the hard drive and SSD in place. There were also a few sneaky screws in the bottom which also had to be taken out. A few screws later and I had both the HDD and SSD in place, and I then reinstalled the enclosure before connecting these two up. If unlike me you have a non-modular power supply, then all the cables you need will be pre-attached, but if you have a modular unit like mine, then it's time to push and click the peripheral cable into the unit and attach the SATA connectors to the other end of the hard drive and solid state drive. Once the necessary SATA power cables are connected, be sure to connect the SATA data cables, usually in red, to any drives, with the other ends attaching to the motherboard. SATA data cables will come included with any new board, but can be bought online separately for pennies. Once again, we're back to my favourite part, the graphics card. This time we're installing it. Again, this involves the push and click method, but be sure to remove as many of these little rear protector gate things as necessary to accommodate the width of your GPU, and connect any required power connectors from the power supply unit to the card. With that, we're just about finished. One final thing though, connect any system fans, like the black one at the back of our case here as well, to the matching motherboard header, whether this be 3 or 4 pin. So while I don't think this is the best system I've put together in terms of value for money, I'd really wanted to build a system as I haven't done so in what feels like forever. Hopefully the little mini build tutorial will help any of you new PC builders out as well. But now, in regards to performance, it's time to check out how this thing handles some modern games, as well as a quick Cinebench R15 multi-core test. Now I tested Cinebench first of all because I wanted to check out the raw CPU performance, and whilst it isn't as powerful as some modern budget quad cores like the Ryzen 3 1200 for example, which is perfectly reasonable considering the age of this CPU, it will still put up a pretty good fight, and I have to say that for editing in Premiere Pro, something that is very CPU intensive, this handled it like an absolute champ, and I edited this entire video on this machine. Let's jump into a few games as well to see how it performs and how these two components work together. Will the i5 bottleneck the 7870, or will it be a completely different situation with the 7870 bottlenecking the CPU? Let's find out. First of all, I started off with Battlefield 1, and my intentions with this build were to be able to run games at 1080p with sort of medium to high settings and sort of get somewhere near 60 frames per second. Battlefield 1 was the perfect example of the dream performance I was aiming for with this machine, and it maintained a pretty solid close to 60 frames per second most of the time at medium-high settings during this opening level. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, a game that's a little harder to run, once again we chose the medium preset, stuck a couple of the settings on high, and I did see a few issues with the benchmark run in terms of stuttering, but I combined the average 1% and 0.1% low figures with a couple of hours of gameplay as well, during which the performance was quite a bit better. In Dirt 4, one of my favourite modern racers, medium settings once again with a couple of things set to high, at full HD, and the game performed flawlessly. I was able to complete not only this solo race here during the opening tutorial, but a couple of multi-competitor events as well, and still retain a pretty solid overall frame rate throughout my half an hour gameplay period with this game. Now the performance of Overwatch will depend on the map that you're playing on, but here on this specific map, forgive me I can't quite remember the name, the game performed very well, once again with a mix of high and medium settings, with the game set to 100% resolution scaling. This means it was running at an untouched 1080p, and I have to say I was very impressed with the performance. The CPU and GPU actually seem pretty evenly paired, but I wouldn't recommend using anything higher than a 7870 with an i5 750, though something more modern like a GTX 1050 Ti for example would be absolutely fine. CSGO is a game that relies more on CPU power, and here it performed very well, although this benchmark run didn't last too long because I have a habit of getting eliminated every 30 seconds, but as you can hopefully see here, the performance of this game was pretty good on this build. Now in Fallout 4, the GPU actually held our i5 processor back, which was quite interesting, so in this case you probably could get away with using a slightly better graphics card, though there will be a few instances of stutter as you explore the open world. Feel free to turn down the settings on a configuration similar to this one in some of those busier and more hardware intensive areas like Diamond City for example. And finally, in Fortnite, you should have no problem with sustaining a smooth 60 frames per second throughout the entirety of any online match, as I did so here. Once again, the GPU was actually the limiting factor, which was quite surprising, so it may be fair to ignore my earlier statement of don't pair anything more powerful than a 7870 with this i5. All in all, I'm pretty happy with the price I paid for all of these components. If you'd like to see more games being tested out on this build, please let me know, because I'll try to put together a list of 20 or 30 games, run through them and let you see what this can do in a variety of other titles as well. As for this video though, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've enjoyed what is probably the first budget build in a very long time. So if you did, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.